The tissue that I'll be talking to you about are circulating white cells, and it's a very important compartment of the host response, because the circulating white cell consists of a large number of critical immune cells that constitute the host response. When the host response is impaired, that's when you develop opportunistic infections, and that's when you increase the propensity to go into organ failure in critical ill patients. Now, one of the key determinants of the well-being of the circulating white cells is the bioenergetics. And underpinning all this is the function of mitochondria. The mitochondria consists of several anatomical components. The main oxidative phosphorylation is driven mainly by complex 1, 2, 3, and 4. There's always a background protein leak. That's physiological. But in excesses, when there's damage, that protein leak starts to escalate to an excessive level, and that in turn can be damaging to the mitochondria. Ultimately, the aim of the mitochondria is to transfer the electron into a coupling process, ending up into producing ATP. And I'm going to go into what happened to those individual components during critical illness. Now, one of the key messages is that mitochondria is both a producer of reactive oxygen species, ROS. At the same time, it is also a victim or target of ROS-induced damage. In fact, if you measure the intracellular ROS, 90% of the ROS come from within mitochondria. And hence lies the predicament for the immune cells in critical ill patients. Because the critical illness, all the cells need to crank up the metabolism to match the energy requirement, to increase the production of ATP. And that inner cell can actually produce, as a byproduct, a lot of ROS. And the ROS in turn can cause damage to the mitochondria through a multitude of different organisms. So the mitochondria need to develop a multitude of different defense mechanisms to maintain the homeostasis. Within the mitochondria itself, there's at least about 8 to 9 antioxidant defense mechanisms. And outside mitochondria, within the cytoplasm, there's also a number of defense mechanisms just to maintain the homeostasis, just to make sure that to maintain the welfare of the leukocyte. Now I'm going to focus on 3 strategies deployed by mitochondria to cope with this increased oxidative stress. There's many more, but I'm just going to focus on the 3 that might have implication for therapeutics later on. The first one is perhaps a physiological adaptation. Is that when there's an increased energy demand, you expect there will be increased oxidative phosphorylation, and hence there will be increased production of ROS as a byproduct. And that tends to cause some degree of damage, and complex 1 tend to be the one that's most vulnerable to that damage. And the mitochondria compensate by increasing the efficiency of how complex 1 undergo oxidative phosphorylations. This is the data from one of my postdocs who used high-resolution respirometry to measure intra-mitochondrial oxidative stress, or intramitochondrial ROS, in patients before they go into multi-organ failure and also after they go into multi-organ failure. On the x-axis, you got healthy control followed by day 1, 2, 3, and 4, and 5 of the illness. And you can see that on admission to the hospital, when they're really sick, there's a fairly high elevated level of ROS in their circulating leukocyte. And that is associated with an acceleration of the protein leakage way above the physiological level, perhaps as a sign of impairment to the complex 1. And what's really interesting is how the mitochondria adapt to that rapid rise in the oxidative stress. So the top graph on the left-hand side is exactly the same from the previous graph, but the bottom one on the left-hand side is the percentage of the complex 1's contribution of its oxidative phosphorylation to the overall electron transport function. And the baseline is about 30%, and you can see that on day 2 there's a rapid rise into proportion of its contribution to energy production through oxidative phosphorylation. In other words, its efficiency in a slightly impaired complex 1, as long as the impairment is tolerable, there's a huge acceleration of its efficiency. So it can't sort of it try to make things more efficiently in terms of energy production. And on the right-hand side, interestingly, you can see that that is associated with an increase in ATP. In other words, it increased the efficiency without causing an excessive acceleration in the overall oxidative phosphorylation, and therefore minimize the excessive increase in oxidative stress. Now that's in the pre-organ failure stage, when the amount of oxidative stress is reasonably it's not too excessive, and the cell still can adapt to it. Now, the one on the right-hand side is the patient when they end up in multi-organ failure, where the cells are sicker, the function are more compromised, and more importantly, the amount of oxidative stress is increased. And let's look at what happens. So on the top one is exactly the one that you saw previously, a patient before they deteriorated into multi-organ failure. You can see that there's a rapid increase in the efficiency of complex 1 function. Now that compensatory increase efficiency is completely lost when you look at the bottom slide in patients who have multi-organ failure. You do not see that at all. More interestingly, the black column represents those who survive, and the white one represents those who did not survive. Over the 6 days, you can see the non-survivor, not only that their compensatory mechanism did not kick in, but there's a further reductions in the efficiency of the complex 1 function. Now, if the cell are able to compensate, that's fine. If they can't, then there is another mechanism that kicked in. Mervyn Singer coined the term mitochondrial hibernation many years ago, so he is the originator of the concept. There's a multitude of reasons to explain the phenomenon, and I'm going to propose just one of them. There are others. So this is a second compensatory mechanism in a more severe sort of a situation. And what we measure here, again, using the same measurement, we look at the overall endogenous respiration, the electron transport system, complex 1 function, complex 2, over 7 days. And on the left-hand side, on the white column, there's a healthy control. All the black ones are the patients. And you can see there's a trough on day 2 and 3, that all these there's an overall general deceleration of the oxidative phosphorylations in those cells. And later on, they start to recover and the patient survives. So somehow, they all decided to slow down. Now, interestingly, on the right-hand side, what we have is on the left y-axis, that is the intramitochondrial loss. So that's the degree of oxidative stress in the mitochondria. On the y-axis, on the right-hand side there, that is the complex 1 functions on the bottom and endogenous respiration. And you can see that it's a really sort of well-connected, synchronized change between the degree of intramitochondrial loss and the degree of hibernation. So as the cells start to slow down, crank down the mitochondrial function, the loss start to drop. And that drop synchronized with the degree of deceleration in the mitochondria. And you can see that on the right-hand side, those two lines almost overlap each other. So they're highly correlated. On the left-hand side is the correlation analysis with a p-value of 4 and the coefficient correlation of 80% to 90%. So they're very much well matched. Maybe it's totally coincidental. This is a correlative analysis. Maybe there's not a causal sort of inference that we can make, but in any case, very interesting we thought. Now, so as a way to deal with that, to protect the cell, it's a sort of a cell preservation mechanism, and that is all fine, but there is a consequence. There is a trade-off. And what we found is that the degree of the hibernation correlate with the degree of organ dysfunction, or SOFA score. Again, this is a correlative analysis. We're not making a causal inference, but the correlation is so tight, we just cannot ignore it. So, in other words, the further the mitochondrial function sort of slow down, the stronger the association with the degree of SOFA score. And there's another trade-off, obviously. On the left-hand side, when the patient, before they went into organ failure, they're able to increase the ATP production in order to supply the energy to deal with the critical illness. And that ability to increase ATP production is completely lost when the mitochondria are hibernated, which is what you expect. So on the right-hand side, I can see that the ATP production progressively reduced over 6 days in those patients who are in established organ failure. This is the transcriptomic analysis over 1,000 patients to see what are the markers that can predict patients who are more likely to die in patients with confirmed sepsis. And again, this is not, we can't really draw causal sort of inference from it, but very interesting association that if your complex 1 gene is upregulated, if your mitochondria is trying really hard to crank up the complex 1 oxidative phosphorylation, you don't tend to do well. Your risk of dying is higher. Now, is that an indirect support for the hibernation theory? I don't know, but that's a really interesting observation. Okay, moving on to the last sort of adaptation mechanism. So the first two are mainly take place inside the mitochondria. So compensation of physiological increasing in the efficiency and hibernation. There's another one that can be activated, and that is sort of orchestrated by a machinery that connect between the mitochondria and the cytosolic mechanism, and this is the glycolysis. And various terms that you can use to describe it, and metabolic reprogramming is one of the terms. Now, if you ask me to design therapy to address mitochondria, there's a huge number of options, experimental and phase 1 clinical trial that's being looked at in other areas, not within sort of intensive care, but outside. There's a number of options being explored. But within the context of what I described, I will perhaps look at the feasibility of addressing metabolic reprogramming as a potential area to design therapy. There's a few reasons for it. This was published by a large group in JAMA, Tom Vanderpoel's group, where they look at patients who were admitted into ICU for sepsis, and they developed superimposed infection, ICU infection later on. And you can see that in terms of the transcriptional profiling of the circulating white cell, those patients who sort of have a really good response in glycolysis, as measured by the upregulation represented here in red, the upregulation of glycolysis genes, they tend to do better. They don't tend to acquire ICU infection. But those who's got downregulated glycolysis gene expression, they tend to do worse. So glycolysis serves a very important purpose. There's a number of benefits. Firstly, it provides an alternative source of energy production other than the oxidative phosphorylation, which causes a lot of ROS. So this one sort of a shift to an alternative pathway. But it also sort of produces metabolic intermediate to fit into another pathway, which is the pentose phosphate pathway, which produce a lot of antioxidants to sort of help to regain the hemostasis. And you can actually theoretically make that switch. And there were speakers later on today who will speak to you a bit more about metformin. But metformin experimentally, we can show that it actually can make that switch to get the cell to turn into an oxidative phosphorylation energy production into a glycolysis energy productions. So what we have is an in vitro experiment using PBMC, this monocyte isolated from healthy volunteers. We stimulate them with LPS, and we can show that LPS itself will get the cell to switch on to glycolysis, but just by a little bit. But once you add metformin to it, you can see the glycolysis goes up. And when you increase the dosage of the metformin, it goes up even further. And that is pretty much true for basal glycolysis as well as the functional compensatory glycolysis. So that's on all the mononuclear cells. If you focus down to monocyte or lymphocyte, we found exactly the same finding. So at least experimentally, in an in vitro setting, we can do that. But whether we can do that in vivo, that's something that we're going to look at next. This is a meta-analysis that's going to come out, might have already come out. It's a meta-analysis done by one of my colleagues based in Czech Republic, and a similar meta-analysis has also been recently published in Critical Care, and basically looking at a very similar data set where they look at observational data of patients before they go into ICU, whether they actually take metformin. And for those who take metformin, it seems to be a suggestion or association of a lesser mortality if they later develop sepsis. Very interesting association. Again, you can't draw any causal inference, but nevertheless, quite interesting. So, in summary, the mitochondria have a number of adaptive mechanisms. I only highlighted 3 here today, but there's many more. First one is just a physiological compensation by increasing the efficiency, complex one, hibernation, and then metabolic reprogramming. And one of the strategies therapeutically is that perhaps you can manipulate the metabolic reprogramming. Thank you.